The night of October 14th was not supposed to matter. It was a Tuesday. Wet pavement on Route 9, the mountain stretch that coiled through the dark hills east of Millbrook. The kind of road that had no streetlights and no shoulders. Just asphalt, fog, and drop-offs that disappeared into nothing on either side. Ryan Callahan had been driving that road for 4 years. Every Tuesday and Friday, late run, 18-wheeler loaded with freight for the depot in Kessler Flats. He knew every curve by feel. He knew where the guardrails had gaps. He knew exactly how many minutes it took. 41, if he didn't stop. And he was not stopping tonight. Sophie was turning 7 in the morning. He had the cake in the passenger seat. Chocolate with yellow frosting. She had been specific about the yellow. He had picked it up from Marion's Bakery on Dunmore Street before his shift, left it in the cab all day, checked it 3 times to make sure the box hadn't tipped. The frosting was slightly smeared on one side. He told himself she wouldn't notice. He knew she would. Sophie noticed everything. She had her mother's eyes. That same way of looking at you that made you feel seen all the way through, like glass. Ryan thought about that sometimes when he was driving these long stretches alone. How much of Claire was already living in that 7-year-old's face? He thought about it and then made himself stop because the road needed his eyes and the grief needed a closed door, at least until he got home. Claire had been gone for 14 months. Brain aneurysm. No warning. She had been making lunch, a grilled cheese, Sophie's request, and then she wasn't there anymore. Ryan had gotten the call from the hospital while he was retorquing a wheel assembly in Bay 3 of the Harmon Freight Depot. He had driven to the hospital with grease still on his hands. He didn't think about that night often, but he thought about it tonight. The rain was doing something to the air, that particular smell of wet road and pine, and it pulled the memory up whether he wanted it or not. He let it sit. Then he put it back. 41 minutes. He would be home by 11:15. Sophie would be in bed, already asleep, but he would check on her. He always checked on her. He would stand in the doorway of her room, not turning on the light, just listening to her breathe, and something in his chest would loosen a little. He was 9 minutes out when he saw the headlights. They weren't on the road. That was the wrong direction. They were below it, to the right, maybe 40 feet down the embankment, tangled in scrub oak and brake ferns. Moving. Not steady. Swinging back and forth in a slow arc, like a lantern. He registered it in pieces. The angle was wrong. The car was on its side. The lights were still burning, which meant the engine was still on, which meant... Ryan pulled over. He was out of the cab before the truck stopped rolling. His boots hit gravel, and he was already moving to the guardrail, already looking down. The car was a dark sedan. Expensive. He could tell by the shape, even at this angle. It had clipped the guardrail. He could see the torn metal, and gone sideways down the embankment, caught in the brush maybe 30 feet before the actual drop. Steam was rising from somewhere near the hood. He didn't think. He went down. The slope was wet clay and loose rock. He slid twice, caught himself on a sapling, kept moving. By the time he reached the car, his jeans were soaked through, and he had a cut on his right palm he wouldn't notice until later. The driver's side was up. He grabbed the handle, locked, and hammered the window once with his elbow. Inside, a woman, conscious. Her forehead was bleeding, the blood running sideways across her temple because of the angle. Her left arm was pinned under something from the back seat, a laptop bag it looked like, wedged hard against the door. She was trying to push it off, and her hand was shaking. "I'm going to get you out," Ryan said. Loud, no question in it. She looked at him through the cracked glass. Her mouth moved. He didn't wait. He grabbed the door handle with both hands and pulled until the locking mechanism gave. It took 3 full seconds of everything he had, and then reached in and worked a laptop bag off her arm. She gasped. He got one arm behind her back, one under her knees, and lifted. She said something. He thought it might have been, "Careful," or "Wait." He didn't stop. He got her up the slope. He was carrying maybe 130 pounds plus his own weight on wet clay at a 40-degree angle, and his boots had no grip, and he did not put her down. At the guardrail, he set her carefully on the asphalt, on her back, legs elevated against the rail, the way he had learned in a first aid course 7 years ago that he had never expected to use. "Stay here," he said. He was already reaching for his phone. The smell came before the sound. Gasoline. Sharp, immediate, unmistakable. Then, a low sound from the embankment, a kind of thump, and then the car was on fire. Not dramatic, just steady orange light moving through the brush below. The woman had her eyes open. She was watching him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the fire. Then he called 911 and talked them through the mile marker and the approximate position of the vehicle and the nature of the injuries. One female, head laceration, possible wrist fracture, stable. And when the dispatcher confirmed a unit was 8 minutes out, he ended the call. He did not give his name. She asked him. He heard it, low, a little rough from the impact. "Who are you?" He was already standing. "Someone will be here in 8 minutes," he said. "You're okay." He went back to his truck. He checked the mirrors until he saw the first blue-red flash coming around the curve, then pulled forward and drove. Sophie's cake was still on the passenger seat. The frosting had smeared a little more. He drove 9 minutes and pulled into the parking lot of his building and sat for a moment with the engine running. His right hand was bleeding onto the steering wheel. He found a gas station receipt in the cup holder and pressed it against the cut. He carried the cake upstairs. He checked on Sophie. She was asleep, her arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, fingers half-curled, breathing even and slow. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The alarm went off at 6:45. Ryan showered, changed, made oatmeal. Sophie came out of her room at 7:12, with her hair in a state and the look of someone who had been awake for a while already, thinking important things. "Is it today?" she asked. "It's today," he said. She sat down at the table and looked at the cake in the box, which was on the counter, which he had not yet put candles in. She looked at it very seriously, the way she looked at things she cared about. "The frosting," she said. "I know." "It's okay," she said. "I like yellow." He put a candle in it right there at the breakfast table, and they sang the song at 7:15 in the morning, just the two of them, Sophie in her pajamas and Ryan still in his work shirt, and she blew it out and didn't tell him what she wished for. He kissed her forehead and dropped her at school and drove to the Harmon Freight Depot. Frank Harmon was waiting for him in the parking lot. Ryan knew, looking at him, that it was already done. Frank had a way of standing when he'd made a decision. Shoulders forward, chin down, hands in his jacket pockets, like he was bracing for weather. "Office," Frank said. The office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. Ryan sat in the chair across from the desk and did not cross his arms. He had learned not to cross his arms in rooms like this. Frank didn't sit. He stood at the window with his back half turned and said, "You missed the end of your shift last night." "I left at 11:02, Ryan said. "My shift ends at 11. You logged out at 10:58. Trucks were still on the lot. I needed someone to do the Kessler check. That wasn't in my schedule. It was a verbal assignment." Ryan said nothing. "You've been a problem, Ryan." Frank turned. "I want to be straight with you. The safety complaints. The brake inspection you flagged in August that cost us a week of paperwork. The maintenance logs you sent to the regional office without running them through me first. I've got 14 drivers. None of them write up half what you do." "The brake on Unit 7 had 40% pad wear," Ryan said. "Below threshold. And we handled it. After I wrote it up. Frank looked at him for a long moment. "You think you're the only honest man in the building," he said. "You know what that makes you? It makes you difficult. It makes you someone who can't be on a team. I've got to let you go." Ryan's jaw set. "My last paycheck," he said. "That'll be processed through HR. You had some compliance issues with my last paycheck," Ryan said again. Same volume, same tone. Frank tilted his head. "You know, it's a tough deal, single dad situation and all. You've got a kid to think about. Maybe think about that before you make things harder for yourself." Ryan stood. Something moved through him. Not heat, not quite. Something that sat lower than anger, closer to the center. "Don't talk about my daughter," he said. He walked out. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes. He did not call anyone. He looked at the dash, at the crack in the corner of the windshield he'd been meaning to get fixed. He thought about Sophie's inhaler, the Flovent, the one she took every morning, $14 a dose with insurance, and the fact that he would need to figure out coverage in the next 30 days. He put the truck in drive. He did not know that 3 miles away in the Meridian Hotel on Caldwell Avenue, a woman was watching traffic camera footage on a laptop in a suite on the 12th floor. He did not know that she recognized the truck. Her name was Diana Mercer. She was 51 years old. She had started her first logistics company at 29 with $40,000 in savings and a lease on a single warehouse unit in New Haven, Connecticut. By the time she was 40, she had absorbed 4 competitors and was operating in 11 states. At 45, she had survived a hostile takeover attempt that 2 different law firms told her was unstoppable. She had stopped it herself in a 14-hour board meeting using a shareholder rights plan she had drafted with her general counsel over a single weekend. She did not scare easily, but she had been scared on Route 9. She remembered the guardrail coming through the windshield. She remembered the car not being horizontal anymore, the world at a wrong angle, the smell of something burning and her arm not moving when she told it to. And then a face at the window, a man's voice very steady, saying something that wasn't a question. The hospital had kept her overnight. 11 stitches above her left temple, a hairline fracture in her right wrist. Her assistant had been there by midnight, her attorney by 2 in the morning. And her assistant's assistant had filed a request with the county sheriff's office for any available traffic camera footage from Route 9 by 6 a.m. She watched the footage twice. The truck, she could read the partial plate, pulled over. A man got out, went over the guardrail, disappeared. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, he came back over the rail carrying her, set her down, made a call, waited for sirens, drove away. She ran the plate. It took until 9 a.m. The truck was registered to Harmon Freight Solutions. The driver assigned to that route, that shift, that Tuesday, was one Ryan Callahan, age 34, of 422 Birch Street, Millbrook. She had her chief of staff pull his employment file through the channels her legal team had access to. What came back was not what she expected. Ryan Callahan had filed 7 separate safety complaints in 18 months. Breakware, maintenance falsification, hours of service violations, drivers being pressured to log fewer hours than they actually drove. 1 complaint had gone to the state DOT. 2 had gone to the regional office. All 7 had been administratively closed. She read the files, all of them. Her wrist was in a brace and her head ached, and she read every page. Then she called her acquisition team. Here is what Diana Mercer had not told anyone. Not her board, not her attorney, not her assistant who had been with her for 9 years and knew nearly everything. The acquisition of Harmon Freight had been stalled for 6 weeks. The valuation was right. The logistics footprint was right. But the company had a compliance ghost. Maintenance records that didn't quite line up, driver hour logs that had small, consistent discrepancies. Nothing that would trigger an audit by itself. Everything that suggested someone had been smoothing the numbers. She had been deciding whether to walk away. She no longer needed to decide. She called Frank Harmon at 10:45 that morning and told him she was prepared to close. He was effusive, grateful. He said he knew she'd made the right call. She let him talk. She scheduled the all-staff meeting for Friday. The Harmon Freight Depot had one conference room. It smelled like the office. Burnt coffee, old carpet. And it held about 40 people if they stood. On Friday, at 8 a.m., all 41 employees were in it. Some standing against the walls, most holding coffee cups. All of them looking at a woman they had never seen before, standing at the front of the room with a brace on her right wrist and 11 stitches under her hairline. Frank Harmon was there too. He was seated at the side of the room, not at the front. He had not been told why. Diana Mercer did not introduce herself at length. She said she was the new owner. She said she wanted to start with something she had watched on Tuesday night. She nodded to someone near the projector. The screen showed Route 9. Camera footage, grainy in the rain, a truck slowing, a man getting out. Some people in the room recognized the truck immediately. A few looked at each other. Someone near the back said something quietly that Ryan would have recognized as his own name, but he wasn't in the room to hear it. Diana let the footage run. 2 minutes. The full sequence. The descent, the wait, the woman over the rail, the call, the departure. She said, "The man in this video worked here until Wednesday morning. He saved my life on Tuesday night." She paused. One beat. He was fired the next morning. The room was very still. Frank Harmon's expression had not changed. He had a particular kind of discipline, the kind that comes from years of confronting workers in small rooms. A flatness of face that he had learned meant power. His hands were resting on his knees, and his breathing was even. Diana said his name. Just his name. Then she told the room what she had found in the maintenance logs. The brake pads on Unit 7, 40% wear, flagged, closed. Hours of service logs, February through July, discrepancies averaging 22 minutes per driver per shift, consistent across 14 drivers, consistent with manual adjustment. Insurance records, 2 vehicles logged as serviced with dates that preceded the service center's own invoices by 11 days. She said each thing simply, no drama, like she was reading a list. Frank said, "You'll have an opportunity to speak with our attorneys," Diana said. "That will be scheduled." He closed his mouth. She spoke for 12 more minutes. She said the company was under new ownership effective that morning. She said an independent audit would be completed within 30 days. She said every withheld paycheck would be reviewed, and any improperly held wages would be returned with interest. She said the safety complaint process was being restructured. Complaints would go to an external body, not internal HR. Then she said she had a job offer to make, and she was going to make it to someone who wasn't in the room. She found Ryan at 422 Birch Street on a Saturday morning. He was in the parking lot of his building, crouched beside a 2009 Civic with the driver's side door open, doing something to the door mechanism with a flathead screwdriver. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a small bleach stain near the hem and work boots that had seen better years. He looked up when she walked across the lot. She watched his face go through several things in quick succession. Recognition, surprise, a flicker of something she couldn't read, and then a kind of settling, like a window closing quietly. He stood. She said, "You left before I could thank you." "I had somewhere to be," he said. She nodded. She looked at the car. "What's wrong with it?" "Door latch. It sticks when it's cold." He was still holding the screwdriver. He looked at it, then set it on the roof of the car. "You should have called. I could have come to you." "I wanted to come here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. You want to come up? The apartment was on the third floor. It was small, a living room with a couch and a television and a bookshelf that had more children's books than anything else, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and toast. A drawing was taped to the refrigerator. A man, a girl, and a dog they did not have, all holding hands, crayon on notebook paper, the man's hands slightly too large. Sophie was on the couch watching something on a tablet with headphones on. She pulled one headphone off when they came in and looked at Diana with the frank appraisal of a 7-year-old. "Are you from Dad's work?" she asked. "Something like that," Diana said. Sophie looked at her wrist brace. "What happened to your arm?" "I had an accident," Diana said. "Your dad helped me." Sophie looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at the kitchen. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. They sat at the kitchen table. Sophie went back to her tablet. Diana watched Ryan pour coffee, careful, automatic, the way people move in their own space, and set a mug in front of her without asking how she took it. She told him about the audit, the maintenance records, what the logs had shown. He listened without interrupting, both hands around his own mug, his eyes on the table. "You knew," she said. "That's why you filed the complaints." "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I didn't know how much." 7 complaints. The first 3 didn't go anywhere. He turned the mug slightly, a half rotation. "I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. Then Unit 7. That one I knew I wasn't reading wrong." "And they fired you?" "Not for that," he said. "Officially." "No," she said. "Officially, you abandoned your shift and demonstrated a pattern of insubordination." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "I'd like to offer you a position," Diana said. "Operations Safety Director. You'd oversee the compliance process for the whole fleet, directly reporting to me. External escalation path, your call. No internal sign-off required." She paused. "The salary range is 90 to 110. We can talk about where in that range." Ryan looked at her. His jaw was still. "There are drivers," he said. "The ones whose pay was held. The logs show at least 6 of them going back 18 months. I know. They'll be made whole. I need that to happen before I sign anything." She looked at him. A long look. Not evaluating, just looking. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. "I need a day," he said. "Of course," she said. She stood. She glanced toward the living room where Sophie had both headphones on again, fully absorbed, one sock half off. "She has your focus," Diana said quietly. Ryan followed her gaze. Something shifted in his face. Slow, involuntary, the way light shifts through a window. "She has her mother's," he said. He called her Sunday afternoon. Said yes. Said he had one more condition. Any future safety complaint from any driver would be logged within 24 hours and acknowledged within 72. In writing. No exceptions. Diana said, "That's already in the draft policy." He said, "Good." She said, "Monday, 9 a.m.? He said, "I'll be there." The audit took 27 days. What it found was not surprising to Ryan and was not surprising to Diana, but it was documented now in writing by a third party, and that was different. Maintenance records falsified across 9 vehicles over a period spanning 3 years. Hours of service logs manually adjusted for 11 drivers. 6 employees with improperly withheld wages totaling, across all 6, $34,000. Frank Harmon was referred to the State Attorney General's office. The company cooperated fully. Ryan's first day in the new role, he called a meeting in that same conference room. He had a list on a yellow legal pad, handwritten because he thought better on paper. He went through it with the drivers. What would change, what they could report, how it would be handled, what happened if it wasn't. One of the older drivers, a man named Tomas, who had been with the company 11 years, raised his hand and said, What if they just find a reason to fire you? Ryan thought about that. Then you find me, he said. Because I'll still care. I just won't be here. Tomas nodded. He seemed to find this satisfactory. The company was renamed in the 4th month. The signage on the depot on Route 9 came down on a Thursday morning. Ryan had driven past it 100 times. He drove past it that Thursday afternoon. Just drove past, didn't stop, and looked at the new sign going up. Mercer Callahan Transport. He drove home. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework, her tongue slightly between her teeth, her handwriting careful and deliberate. "Good day?" she asked without looking up. "Yeah," he said. He hung his jacket on the hook. "Yeah, it was okay." She looked up then. She had her mother's eyes, and she used them now, that way of looking that went all the way through. "Just okay?" she said. He sat down across from her. He pulled her homework toward him and looked at the math problem she was working on. Long division. He turned the paper so he could read it right side up. "It was good," he said. "Hand me a pencil." She handed him a pencil. He worked the problem with her. She told him he was doing it wrong. He told her he wasn't. She showed him the example in the textbook. He was doing it wrong. He fixed it. She went back to the next problem, satisfied. The thing about Ryan Callahan that took time to understand was that he did not think of himself as a good person in any particular way. He thought of himself as a person who had work to do. The work changed. Mechanic, driver, safety director, father. But the quality of attention he gave it didn't. Every brake pad was the brake pad. Every form was the form. Every morning at 6:45 was the morning at 6:45. Sophie had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, which was not a small thing to inherit. Diana Mercer came to Millbrook on a Wednesday in December. She had a board meeting in the city the following morning, and she could have stayed overnight there. She had an apartment in Midtown, 12 floors up, clean lines, a view of the park. But she drove to Millbrook instead. She told herself it was because she had documents for Ryan to review. He had the documents reviewed before she got through the door. She stayed for dinner. Ryan made pasta. Simple, fast. The kind of dinner a person makes when they've been doing it alone for a while. Sophie told Diana about her school project on the water cycle in considerable detail, with drawings. Diana asked questions that were not polite questions but actual questions. Follow-up questions. The kind that required having listened to the previous answer. At 8:30 Ryan told Sophie it was time and Sophie went, without significant negotiation, which Diana noted was either impressive discipline or exhaustion. Diana helped Ryan with the dishes. Not because she needed to. She picked up a dish towel and started drying, and he didn't say anything about it. "You didn't have to come out here," he said after a while. "I know," she said. He handed her another plate. She dried it. "The documents could have been emailed," he said. "They could have," she agreed. He looked at her sideways. His hands were in the dishwater, and his expression was the one she had started to understand. Careful and quiet. Like a man deciding how far to trust a new road. "Okay," he said, just that. She set the plate in the cabinet. Outside, the December rain had started. Light, barely there, the sound of it a soft percussion against the kitchen window. Ryan turned off the faucet. The kitchen was very still. "She liked your questions," he said. "Sophie. She doesn't answer questions she thinks are fake." "I know," Diana said. "I could tell." "She asked me after bath time if you were going to come back," he said. He picked up the dish towel. "I told her I didn't know." Diana was quiet. "I'd like to," she said. He folded the dish towel, set it on the counter. He looked at it for a moment, not at her, and his jaw was set the way it got when he was thinking about something careful. "Okay," he said. Same word, different weight. She drove back to Millbrook 3 more times that month and twice in January, And by February, no one at the office mentioned it because it was simply a fact now, like the new sign on the depot and the quarterly compliance report and the Wednesday afternoon staff check-in that Ryan ran with the same yellow legal pad. Some things become true slowly. You don't notice the exact moment. You just look up one day and they're there. There is a particular quality to Route 9 in April. The fog lifts earlier. The trees on the embankment have that new green look, tender and almost wrong in its brightness, like something that doesn't know yet how hard the world can get. The guardrail has been repaired. You can see where the new section meets the old, a slightly different shade of silver. Ryan drives it on Tuesday mornings. Not freight anymore. He drives his own car now, a Civic that no longer has a sticky door latch because he fixed it properly in January. He drives it because the depot is 7 miles up the road, and because he knows every curve. He passes the place where it happened. He doesn't slow down. He thinks about Claire sometimes on that stretch. Not the way he used to, not the grief of it, the weight. More like a conversation that's still going. He'll notice something. The way the fog sits in the low places, the smell of pine and wet road. And he'll have a thought he would have shared with her, and he shares it anyway, in the particular way you learn to do when someone is gone but hasn't stopped mattering. Sophie told him last week that she wants to be an engineer. She had been very definite about it. He asked what kind. She said she hadn't decided yet, but something that fixed things. Something where you could see what you'd done. He had looked at her across the breakfast table, 7 years old, going on something much older, her fork in one hand and her certainty in the other. And he had said, "Yeah, that's a good job." She had nodded seriously and gone back to her eggs. He thinks about that now, driving Route 9 in the April morning, the new green trees on the embankment, the repaired guardrail, what it means to fix something. Not the dramatic version, not the fire and the flash, the slow version. The audit that took 27 days. The 6 drivers who got checks in the mail and didn't expect them. The policy document that meant the next guy who noticed something wrong had somewhere real to send it. The ordinary work of making things more honest. He passes the guardrail. He drives on. 41 minutes to the depot. He knows every curve. At Mercer Callahan Transport, the first quarterly safety report under the new compliance structure was completed on March 31st. 0 violations, 6 driver commendations, 1 anonymous letter sent to the general inbox from a driver who had been with the company for 8 years. It said, "I filed a report in 2021. Nothing happened. I filed one last month. Someone called me back in 2 days. I don't know who's reading this. I just wanted someone to know it's different now." Diana read it. She printed it and put it in a folder. She didn't file the folder anywhere. She kept it on her desk. If this story stayed with you, if Ryan reminded you of someone you know, or someone you wish you knew, drop a comment below. Tell us what part hit you. We read every single one. Stories like this don't go viral because they're loud. They spread because they're true in the way that matters. The quiet, stubborn, no applause kind of true. If that means something to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we share is about the ordinary people doing the right thing in the dark when nobody's watching. Thank you for watching this one. It meant something to make it. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room. The faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility. Someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp's stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped. She hesitates, torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide. This story reminds us that truth does not become less true simply because the wrong person speaks it. Marcus lost credibility in society's eyes, but his knowledge, integrity, and purpose never disappeared. Sometimes the world dismisses people not because they are wrong, but because listening to them is inconvenient. The story also shows that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Dr. Thorne looked trustworthy, while Marcus looked suspicious. Yet goodness and evil rarely announce themselves clearly. Real judgment requires patience and humility. Another powerful lesson is that expertise and identity are not the same as social status. Marcus remained a scientist even while pushing a cleaning cart. Titles may disappear, but skill, character, and conviction endure. Finally, the story teaches that redemption and trust are possible. Eleanor learns to dismantle her assumptions. Marcus reclaims his place in the world, and Chloe's survival becomes more than a medical victory. It becomes proof that believing in the overlooked can save lives. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional stories about resilience, justice, and second chances. And tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Marcus in that hospital room? Sometimes one decision changes everything, and your answer might reveal more than you think. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room: the faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility: someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp's stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped. She hesitates, torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide. This story reminds us that truth does not become less true simply because the wrong person speaks it. Marcus lost credibility in society's eyes, but his knowledge, integrity, and purpose never disappeared. Sometimes the world dismisses people not because they are wrong, but because listening to them is inconvenient. The story also shows that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Dr. Thorne looked trustworthy, while Marcus looked suspicious. Yet goodness and evil rarely announce themselves clearly. Real judgment